After his conversation with Penelope, Odysseus the beggar lays in bed, alert to the fact that the maidservants are leaving the house to go and sleep with the suitors. Athena causes him to fall asleep, and in the morning Odysseus prays to Zeus for an omen of support. His prayer is answered, and his heart leapt up, convinced he'd grind the scoundrels' lives out in revenge. The palace is alive in preparation for a feast in honor of Apollo. We are introduced to a new character, the cowherd, who is immediately reminded of King Odysseus when he sees Odysseus the beggar for the first time. Athena stirs up the suitors, and one of the suitors throws an oxhoof at Odysseus. Telemachus chastises the suitor, and the suitors ask Telemachus to have Penelope choose a new husband. Athena whips the suitors up into a frenzy, and the prophet, Theoclymenus, leaves the palace as he is so troubled by his visions of a house drenched in blood. The book ends with the suitors mocking Telemachus, Telemachus bearing it stoically while looking at his father, and Penelope listening to every word said in the hall. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books Podcast. You can check us out on thegreatbookspodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter and YouTube. Today we are discussing Book 20 in Homer's The Odyssey, continuing our year of Homer. And today we have a wonderful guest. We have Dr. Jennifer Frey, who serves as the Dean of the new Honors College at the University of Tulsa. And amongst her many accolades, she also has her own podcast, Sacred and Profane Love. So welcome, Dr. Frey.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about the new Honors College. It's not every day that someone gets to come into town and start their own Honors College. So tell us a little bit about its mission and its vision.
Yeah, so like every other honors college in this country, it started out as an honors program in the College of Arts and Sciences. I inherited about 5 banker boxes worth of files, which are just the honors files. And I actually just went through every single one of them a few weeks ago. And I found that the honors program began in 1979. It was founded by an English professor named Manly Johnson, which is an amazing name. And it wasn't even Great Books. It became Great Books in about 1985. It was taken over by a philosopher named Paul Brown. And there was a big NEH grant, and they revised the curriculum, and they kind of modeled it on the Columbia Core, right? Which is sort of one of the, people forget that the Columbia Core was originally called Columbia Honors. And people also forget that honors education was originally based on a kind of Oxbridge model. First honors program was at Swarthmore, founded by a Rhodes Scholar who wanted to bring a kind of Oxbridge style of study to American students. And it was this kind of classic text tutorial style way of approaching general education. That was the model for St. John's College, also founded by 2 Rhodes Scholars, Columbia, and eventually, there was the Great Books at the University of Chicago, but that was one professor moving from Columbia down to Chicago and starting his own program. So honors education, which is a uniquely American phenomenon, right? There are no honors programs or honors colleges anywhere else. It was originally, founded on a close, careful reading of classic texts. So we're very much in that tradition. But we're making this huge transition now from a program to a college, which is basically just going from a special program in arts and sciences that was always very allied with the College of Arts and Sciences to our own college, right? So we have more autonomy now and support. This is really the vision of Brad Carson, president of TU, who is a Rhodes Scholar and it just thinks that great books is a great education, and really wanted to center that at Tulsa in a way that had never been centered before. So we had an incoming class of about 170 freshmen. The typical incoming class for the honors program was like 25. So we've scaled up significantly, and we'll probably have an even larger class next year. And we also want to open up honors to everyone, not just professors in arts and sciences, but really anyone who's interested in teaching great books. The thing about great books education that's so unique is it's not geared towards Wissenschaft or expertise or narrow knowledge. It's liberal learning. It's kind of proudly amateurish in the sense that the point of reading it is to become a more reflective and hopefully wiser person. And the texts that we choose in any kind of great books curriculum are texts that we think are geared towards engaging students and professors together on those questions that are kind of at the heart of human existence, those kind of existential questions. I taught in the Great Books Corps at the University of Chicago. That was my first job out of grad school. And it's just called Human Being and Citizen. And that's just taken from a line in Plato's Apology when Socrates, who is defending his life, asks the Athenian jury, what sort of knowledge is this? The knowledge of being a good human being and citizen, right?
Mhm.
And of course, he's talking about the kind of knowledge that a virtuous person possesses. But the conceit of naming the Great Books Corps Human Being and Citizen is that, well, in investigating the question, what sort of knowledge is this, right? As the question has been posed, right, throughout the millennia, as we enter into this kind of great conversation with the mighty dead, we will hopefully, right, attain a modicum of self-knowledge and wisdom along the way. So that's also my perspective. That's what we're trying to do. So if you look at, I don't know if you can see it. This is our seal.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, so our motto is sapientia, virtus, amicitia, right? So wisdom, virtue, friendship. I kind of think those are a package deal. And that's what our curriculum, our college, our student experience is aimed. Those are the ends that we're aimed at. And I think it's also important to mention that we're a residential college, right? And that is kind of part of it. So we're a living learning community. So we're studying together in seminars, but our students also live together in the dorm. And we have a lot of extracurricular events that are designed to supplement our curriculum, so as to foster these conversations outside the classroom. Something that we know, it's just a fact, is that most of the learning happens outside the classroom, and is kind of peer-to-peer. So that's where friendship comes into it. And we kind of want to try to foster and model for our students intellectual friendship, right? Where the activities and aims that are the basis of the shared life together and the mutual affection between friends is the life of the mind, and kind of growing together in wisdom and virtue, hopefully. That's what we're trying to do, at least.
So when I teach the great books, I mainly teach it to adults. I'm teaching it. I have a Sunday great books group at my house. It's mainly all young men that have small children that want to read the great books. So when their kids become older, they actually can like have these conversations with them, right? They've discovered the importance of
I love it.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
it's really wonderful. It's a joy to be with them. And then I also teach it in the diaconate program. So we're blessed in the Diocese of Tulsa that we have a great book sequence as part of our diaconate formation program. And so you're usually guys in their 40s and 50s that are really reading the Iliad for the first time. But they, at this point in their life, they've kind of realized that most of their education has been a training, and they know that they're lacking something. And so there's a hunger for the great books.
Mm-hmm.
When you, because I know as part of your job, you go to high schools and you talk to young people about, hey, you should come to the honors college at TU. What do you think for that demographic, the draw is for the great books? Like, is it the friendship? Is it just like the human excellence? Like, have you found anything that seems to draw them into the honors college?
I think here, there is a little bit of a problem, and that is the problem that is not unique to great books. It's actually a problem for any practice that is intrinsically good. Because the thing is, when we try to justify it from the outside, like if you try to explain to someone why they should be a parent, because it's so hard, it's relentlessly hard. And people write books like this, where the conceit is, oh, well, actually, like it benefits you and it benefits society. And all these things are true. It's not like you're saying something false, but you're actually like not getting at the thing. And in some way, you only get the thing by doing the thing. It's like the good is internal to the practice. That's hard to convey, especially when you have like 10 minutes on a stage right after, Friends of Finance or the Jolt program. It's like, let me convey to you the awesomeness of reading the Republic, which is really long and hard and at times pretty crazy. Like, I don't know. It can be a hard task. I think, frankly, for a lot of students, they just hear honors and they think, oh, okay, I'm always honors, right? That's me. I'm always A+ and blue ribbon, and they don't really need more than that. I think, my elevator pitch is just that in the honors college, we educate you not for a career, but for life, right? And that you're made for more than a life of work. And the real questions that everybody faces is like, what's my money for? What's my work for? What's my life for? And we work together to try to help students figure that out for themselves, right? And so I talk about, how our curriculum is oriented towards the true and the good and the beautiful. And there are students who will get that hook. There are students who are just like honors, blue ribbons. It's a mixed bag. But frankly, I think every elevator pitch kind of fails, right? I mean, it is true that you're made for more than a life of work, and it is true that you probably don't, in fact, have a lot of self-knowledge. You probably don't actually have a good account of what you believe or why or who you are or what your purpose is. And it turns out that to lead a human life, you need that. But that doesn't really capture the experience or the joy of study, So whenever you're trying to justify it from the outside, you kind of lose the thing a little bit. But, the real thing is to get them doing it. Right. And then for the vast majority of them, the experience justifies itself. It's like when you have your kid and you feel this love that you've never felt before, and you didn't need to read that book. Like that book is meaningless now, right? So it's the same tension.
No, I like that a lot. I've seen this. I like what you said about friendship. Because one, I think we have an epidemic of loneliness. Like people are just kind of
we absolutely do.
Yeah. I was looking at this chart the other day about how people have met their spouses. And it's not just that the internet has gone up, right? That people have
Mm-hmm.
dating sites or whatever, but it's that
Mm-hmm.
every other communal aspect that you would actually have a connection with someone has plummeted, whether it's like
Yeah.
friends or church or whatever. And so I like what you're doing a lot in the honors college with friendship and incorporating that into
Mm-hmm.
education, because I think for most people those
Mm-hmm.
two aren't tethered together.
Right.
But they work so well even from a like practical standpoint, because one, I think people are drawn to the friendship. So like, the Sunday Great books that I have, the first 30 minutes is just, Scotch bourbon and charcuterie boards and just chatting with men that are trying to live life together, right?
Yeah.
But then also that friendship then is so important to just reading the text itself. I think about half the men that are in my Sunday Great books had tried to read the Iliad before
Mm-hmm.
and had all quit
Mm-hmm.
because they were just
Right.
reading it by themselves. But
Yeah.
now they love it. And they love it because they
Yeah.
read it in a group, and, iron sharpens iron, and they have these perspectives, and like there's been bonds that have been made. And I completely agree with you that trying to like explain how that works is somewhat sterile. Like it's hard. You
Mm-hmm.
have to experience it to actually understand that fraternity that I think comes in not only with the people you're reading, but also with the authors.
Right. And I mean, especially with Homer, right? I mean, lots of people might be able to pick up a Henry James novel and just read it because it's psychologically gripping and it's familiar, right? Um, that's not Homer, right? Like you pick up Homer and it's like, wait, what? It's very alien. I mean,
Hmm.
Homer's world is very alien, but then Homer's poetic form is alien. And there's so many reasons for this. One is just it's an alien culture and society, even though it is the roots of our own. But it also isn't, it's not really a book, actually, right? I
Right.
mean, this is a poem
Mhm.
that is part of an oral tradition, which would be performed during a festival, right? And so students are like, it's so repetitive. And it's like, yeah, that's the point,
Right.
right? You have to imagine the actual context of this, which is not a book, right?
Mhm.
And, and sort of, and I feel like that the epic in general, is something that feels removed from us because in terms of our own literary culture, like we don't, for a lot of interesting reasons, like we don't really do that. It would be like, I don't even think if someone really wanted to write like an epic poem right now of America, like, would it just be terrible? I don't know.
Yeah.
This is a question I ask myself actually a lot. I'm inclined to say yes, like you, somehow we don't live in that world anymore, but maybe
Mhm.
I'm lacking in imagination. But the epic form itself, I think, is somewhat remote from us now. Um, and then there's also the fact that I mean we don't really read anymore. Like a lot of people. I mean, I do obviously. But I was just always like that. I was a bookworm,
Mhm.
like from the beginning. I just kind of came out that way. Um, but it was very much like kind of against the culture. I mean, I remember as a kid, my parents being like, why you always have your nose on a book, right?
Right.
Because it was true. Even when, and it drove my parents crazy because we went on these long vacations and they'd be like, look at this. And I'm like back there with and they're just like, put down the book. And I'm like, I don't want to.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I know. We have. Sometimes I remember that I live in a different world because I have friends that they don't really have any screens in their house, and they'll be like, Timmy he misbehaved yesterday, and we just had to ban him from reading for a week. And it's like, oh, that's how you punish your children, is they can't
Yeah.
go read novels and stuff anymore because that's like their primary form of what's going on.
Right. That would have been a real punishment for me. For my kids, not so much. I have to be real with you.
Right.
But I just think we don't, if you have habits of reading, you can take those habits and kind of apply them anywhere and get by. But if you don't really have those deep habits of reading, Homer's a heavy lift. So I get people just being like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's where
How
that
many times
fraternity comes
how
in.
many times can they talk about the wine dark sea and
Right.
swift-footed Achilles? And it's like, oh, look, it's another sea battle. Woohoo. It's
Right.
another war game.
Yeah, I mean, Tommy, like on this podcast, as we've moved through the Odyssey, like we've felt like somewhat redundant of like, okay, so we're going to talk about guest friendship again, because that's a dynamic that's like playing out right now. But do you have like, where are you on like Homer the teacher? So I agree with you. Like Homer demands a close reading. One of the reasons in the Diaconate, I tell them in that if you become a good reader of Homer, you'll become a much better reader of Scripture because you'll notice a lot of these details, these like patterns. But with Homer himself, like do you see him more as like a teacher, like he's trying to teach us about human nature, arete, like what it means to be a good person, or do you see him more as like a reflection of his culture?
So I would say both, I guess. So I mean, let's just set aside all the questions about whether there was a Homer and who actually, like, who's responsible for what we're discussing now.
Mm-hmm.
Just set it aside because it's in some sense it just doesn't matter, and also we just don't know. So, you know, um, but like one thing, so someone that has really influenced me generally, but also with respect to thinking about Homer is Alistair McIntyre.
Hmm.
So Alistair wrote a book in the early 80s called After Virtue. And it's kind of this sweeping history or genealogy in a way. It's a kind of genealogy
Mm-hmm.
of ways of thinking about how to live well, to put it in its most generic term. And chapter 10 in that book is the virtues and heroic societies. And it basically it's mostly a reflection on Homer. And it comes just before the chapter on the virtues in Athens. And the thing that's really clear is that they're different,
Mm-hmm.
right? And something that Alistair points out, which I think is true, is that there wasn't really a sharp distinction in the Homeric world between what is being represented by the poem and the society, right? It's an epic poem, so it's looking back, right? All epic poems
Right.
are looking back to some kind of history that is, in some sense, a founding or a giving birth to whatever it is now. Um, and that's true for Homeric epic as it would be for biblical epic. Um, but in in Homer, kind of the epic that's portrayed in the poem, it's not so different from the social life or the social forms. And so, yeah, the Homeric heroes are archetypes, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
meant to be teaching us, but the us, I think, is not universal. So that is to say, I don't think that Homer or that this tradition um, claims to be saying anything beyond its own society. So, for example, another text that has really affected how I read Homer. There's a book by Eric Auerbach called Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. And the very first essay in this, one of the best books of criticism ever written, hands down, is called Odysseus' Scar.
Oh.
And it's such an incredible, learned essay, especially if you consider that the author was writing this in exile in Istanbul in World War II. So he's no library. He barely has his books. It's astonishing when you read it. It's almost like a Boethius type situation where
Yeah.
you realize like he wrote the Consolation of Philosophy just like in a dungeon. And you're like, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do that. Like he's just doing it from memory. It's
Mm-hmm.
incredible. But basically he sets up a contrast. Auerbach sets up a contrast between biblical epic
Hmm.
and Homeric epic. And what he ends up saying is that in the Old Testament, what you have is people and history where development is crucial. So you really see characters develop, things are unexpressed. Background is really critical. So, like, the way things are progressing is essential because this is an attempt to be a kind of universal history, and it demands interpretation, right? And so he has this beautiful exegesis of the story of Abraham and Isaac and how so much is unexpressed, and everything that you're going to get out of this text is interpretation. And then he contrasts it with what happens in book 19 of the Odyssey, which is why it's called Odysseus' Scar. And he says, look, what you find in Homeric epic is everything is externalized, right? Every thought, every feeling, it's right there on the page. There's actually not a lot to interpret. It's all kind of given to you. And there's actually like no real development in Homeric epics. And part of that is because of the role of fate, like we know, right? Like we know and they know. Right. And this is something that Alistair brings up in a totally different way. I mean, I always read these two together, but they're coming at it from totally different approaches. You know, Alistair's interest is moral theory. But he kind of says the same thing, right? Like the hero in Homeric epic is someone who is good, is excellence. It expresses arete, excellence, insofar as he understands his fate, right, and accepts it, and has the courage, right, to do what it takes to live accordingly, and who also understands his role, right, like. And so all of the virtues, right, of Odysseus, right, have to do with understanding his role, his place in this drama, and like all of his forms of excellence are about that. And so it's not, this isn't about individual self-expression or autonomy. It's not about, you know, God helping you become the person you need to be. It's just about knowing your role and having, you know, the character and the thumos to enact it, which in most cases, right, is to die a certain way.
Right.
And there's something. I mean, you know, there may be nuance getting lost here, of course, but there is something to this. You know, the biblical epic is an attempt to communicate salvation history, right? Homeric epic is not. Right. I don't think there's the same pretense about its being about everyone. So I was always struck by but they're both undeniably epic, right? Like they both deserve to be called epic. So I think that Homer is, or Homeric poetry is unique, and there is a lot to learn from it. Not just about, well, this is what the Greeks thought, or this is what the Greeks. Because actually you do see, I mean these are men, right? these are human beings in these stories, and it is a human drama, but I do think it's a more alien one, and you see this with students because one thing that really trips students up when they're reading Homer and talking about Homer is the fact that they don't seem free in the way that we would expect them to be. Like, so much of what happens to them is kind of the gods taking over. So even think about book 20, right? Like, in the end, they're all overcome by a kind of frenzy or madness. And that that's the gods kind of working on them, right? Or they're inspired to action, or they're just simply doing what the gods want them to do, right? With some interesting, notable counterexamples. But
No, I very much agree. I think the role of fate is something that we've been tracking very closely. And there's a little bit of a caricature that, like, the Iliad is very, very fatalistic, which it really is. I mean, if you read, like, I don't even know what Hector's supposed to do, right? I mean, he just basically has to react to this, and whether he's actually reacting or he's just he's kind of an empty vessel that's just being filled with divine providence, and he just kind of plays it out like a puppet. But there's kind of a character sometimes that the Iliad is very fatalistic, and then the Odyssey tends to have like a lot more agency, right? And on this read through, I don't know, this is maybe my third or fourth read through. On this read through, I'm actually really starting to doubt that or challenge that. I think maybe Homer just got better at his rhetoric, because the more I look at it on these scenes that they say, oh no, look, people have a choice here. I'm not really sure they have a choice, particularly if you look at the overall narrative. And I think book 20 is like this. And this is something we've been tracking, is that you see several times that the suitors start to realize, oh, something's terribly wrong, or we probably shouldn't be doing this, right? Or they start to chastise each other. And Homer almost gives us this thing where they start to shift towards, maybe there should be like a metanoia here, right? Maybe there should be like a repentance and we should turn around. And very clearly, Homer tells us that Athena comes in and stops them from doing that, right? That they're basically, their fate is bound. And not only does she stop them from maybe what we would say acting well or acting good, but then she actually moves them into acting poorly, right? So she's the one that actually inspires the guy to throw the oxhoof, right? She actually explicitly inspires him. And then also, at the end, I mean, they're like frothing mad. They're in a divine frenzy here, right? And so there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's sort of, it reminds me of the Bacchae, right? It's like everybody just loses it. Divine madness, theomania.
I very much agree.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something again that Alistair talks about. He says, look, in Homeric poetry, fate is a reality, and also kind of descrying fate is a social role, and that's why the prophet and the seer is so important, right? It's always there, and of course, it's in tragedy as well. But what is heroic, right, within this context, is the man who can do what he ought to do, which is to move towards his fate and death, right? Whatever it may be, and of course, courage is. I don't know if I want to go so far and say that it's the master virtue in Homeric poetry, but it's certainly very important or foregrounded. But courage and fate are very tightly bound up together. And this is part of, I always joke with philosophers that like a Kantian must be so triggered by reading Homer, because these are people who are not laws unto themselves, right? They're not autonomous. These are not people for whom their own individual will is the ground of goodness and badness. It's the exact opposite, right? So what does a Kantian say, right, when they encounter Homer, right? Are these people who just totally get it wrong and actually we shouldn't read them? Or is there some truth here? And I think it's, as Catholics, it's much easier for us to see, oh no, there's some truth here, right? Like, actually, life is fragile. We are vulnerable and we don't control. We're not in control, right? It is an illusion or in a fantasy to think that we are in control or that our own autonomy is what really matters. Now, Christian providence is not the same as Homeric fate. And, Christian grace is not the same as Greek theomania, but they are related, right?
Right.
And that gets back to this fact that, look, these are human beings,
Yeah, because I think that,
right? And so there is a common nature there,
right.
and common experiences that are being made sense of in different ways.
And I think that's something that I'm very sensitive to, is that, even, what's Homer's intent and to what degree is he a reflection of culture and stuff like that. Regardless of that, we still share a human nature with them, right? There is a universal that
Yeah.
actually like connects us. And so even if
Yes.
some of the characters are somewhat flat, at times they kind of serve as analogs, right? So they don't develop the same way we think they should develop, right? In like a novel. Even though we see Telemachus,
Right.
has his kind of maturation journey. But I do think at times they serve as like an analog to some type of commentary on human nature. And here, I think to a lot of your points, like if you look at just looking at the text of book 19, I mean, Odysseus is in his home. And kind of when you talked about like the reliance on fate, and like the arete in a lot of ways is just being able to execute on your fate as you should. It's interesting to me here that like he's not going to do anything until Athena gives him the green light, right? It's not like his own arete. It's not like his own cunning, right? In a lot of ways, he's kind of backstopped by Athena. So everyone looks at him as like, oh, you're the cunning master, X, Y, and Z strategist. But actually, he's just backstopped by Athena. And you see this, and he actually, I don't know if he's doubting a little bit here, but you see that he, when he's laying awake, this is like line 40 or so, and I'm looking at Fagles. Like he's like saying like, okay, how am I actually going to take over the suitors? Like, how am I going to kill them? And what about all their avengers that come in? Like, how are we going to do this? And it's interesting that Athena basically tells him, like, if you look at Athena's answer, it's a non-answer. She actually just chastises him for not having faith. She doesn't actually tell him anything about the plan. She just chastises him for not, obeying this divine will. And then she sprinkles sleep over him and he falls asleep. And then the first thing he does when he wakes up, for the most part, is that even after Athena has told him it's going to be okay, you need to play your part. Then the first thing he does is he asks Zeus for an omen. And I found this really interesting that Athena, like, you literally have a goddess coming and talking to you, right? Which is more than most, right? You have a goddess coming and talking to you, and she tells you basically just hold the course. And he still has to have these signs, right? He has to have these signs that fate's on his side, which he gets, right? I mean, Zeus, Zeus, I mean, obviously he's the primary, kind of primal god. I'm not sure how much daylight there is between Zeus and fate and Homer overall. But also, I think we have to keep in mind with guest friendship that Odysseus is basically planning to kill all the guests in his house. And it's very important for him under guest friendship, which Zeus has this patronage, that Zeus agrees with this line of action, right? That like fate has to allow him to do this, or he's going to, cast condemnation on his own head. But to your point about like the ubiquitous role of fate, he can't do much in this book without making sure he's aligned with the gods.
Yeah, I mean fate, and then also honor, right? So and they're inseparable. And I think that it's interesting to try to unpack that. What I try to do when I'm teaching this, which is not, I don't just lecture to them, but I do give them a series of questions to constantly be asking themselves, like, what picture of human agency are we getting here, right? What picture of courage are we getting here? What picture of glory and honor, right? Like, can you track this as the narrative goes on? And then also it's like, were you ever surprised? Right? Like, why or why not? And so it's kind of like, and of course there is a narrative here. But it's not focused on this kind of personal development and things like this. And insofar as the inner lives, insofar as the characters have inner lives, which of course they do, but they're right there on the page, right? Like we don't have to wonder what Achilles is feeling. We know, right? Like we're told. Um, and the so much of the emphasis is also on action. But there are there's also like interesting bits about the role of strangers in the sense of um, people who are in some sense outside of this order, which I think the Cyclops are, strangers in the relevant sense, but also in a way like we as readers are strangers,
Hmm.
in some sense, looking on this from the outside, trying to puzzle through it. What people might ask, well, how is reading Homer, right, supposed to make me wise? And I think especially sometimes Christians are like, why should I be reading this pagan stuff?
Right.
Right? I should just read the Bible and the fathers and that's it. And I think, the best answer to that's in Augustine, right? It's like, no, you have to understand these things as forerunners, right? And you have to see how all of history, not just literary history, is in fact part of providence.
Right.
Um, and
But we
that
talk a lot
and
on
that
here.
there
We talk a lot on here about why start with Homer? Why? I mean, you could also read Confucius. You could also read the Enuma Elish. There's plenty of other things that you
Epic
can
of
start with.
Gilgamesh,
Right, which is
right?
actually a fun read. And
Yeah.
one of the things that we talk about is that, particularly coming from the Catholic perspective, is that I think that, you take the incarnation as your guidepost, right? You take that as your marker. And then when you see it like that, I think in a lot of ways, how I would view it is that Greek Hellenized culture, right, flows into Hebrew culture. It flows into the Old Testament. So clearly, like, if we're going to understand Jesus, it's like, well, you got to read the Old Testament. Okay, it's very good. But also, you need to
Yeah.
read this Hellenized thought because it actually flows into the Old Testament prior to Christ. Then, Christ is the Logos incarnate. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
Right? What is that
Right.
concept? And the whole New Testament's written in Greek. So I think in a lot of ways, like when we're reading it, particularly like in the diaconate program, the context is, there are really nascent conversations here about human nature, right? Like I agree with you.
Oh,
Like a
for
lot of
sure.
these things are kind of flat compared to like what we're used to, but it's because we're downstream from Homer, and he starts a lot of these
Mhm.
things. And as you're talking, it really kind of then makes me think about how unique it is that, two things come to mind. One is we do see some development with Telemachus and how maybe unique that is to the Homeric writings, right? Because he starts off as a young boy who can't even talk to Nestor, right? He can't. I mean, there's an irony there, right? That the son of the master rhetorician has no idea how to speak because he's suffering from a fatherlessness. Then by this book, and we see this in several cases, he's owning the house, but he's also looking at his father, right? Because he knows his father's there, so he has that coverage.
Mhm.
The other one too, and someone pointed this out to me, and then your context is really helping me understand why it was such a unique passage, is that when Odysseus, I don't remember what book it is, but when Odysseus escapes Calypso, finally, and he's being tossed about by the waves, he, in that passage, addresses his own spirit, his own thumos, 3 times. And I read, I think Dr. Frank Grabowski, who's been on the podcast a few times and also helps out with our local Alcuin Institute, he pointed it out to me that how unique this was actually in Western literature, and particularly for the Homeric period, that you have someone reflecting, right? You have someone actually addressing themselves. And so it's interesting as you mention this, those small little passages that I think are, they kind of bleed into the Western culture that we become much more accustomed to them, right? But here they're just beginning in Homer. And I think your context has really helped me understand then how unique those passages actually are.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this question about where do we start, you have to start somewhere, right? And but it makes sense to start with Homer for us, right? That is to say, as Americans, right? We're Americans. That's just like a contingent fact about us. And um, our society and our way of life has its roots in Homer. Like, this is a fact. And so our whole literary tradition, our whole philosophical tradition, right? Socrates talks about Homer. Aristotle talks about Homer. This is something that is, by the way, even remote for them, that they are inheriting and reflecting on.
Mm-hmm.
And we, as the Western, and Western is really just, honestly, it's like the crossroads of the Mediterranean. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff bubbling up in there. It's not, the kind of Mediterranean, the crossroads of the Mediterranean, which involves all kinds of influences, right? All of which are very fluid. It's like it's in a way, and you could say this anachronistically, it's Proto-European, but it's not European, right? That comes much later. And but that is where our society is coming from, and an even narrower strand of that, right? And so it does make sense for us to start with Homer. If the goal is to gain self-knowledge and wisdom, right? Understand kind of where we are, think about whether or not we are where we ought to be. We have to understand our own past. And so it does make sense to start with Homer, because these are stories, right, that we've inherited and that we know, right? It's not like weirdly American to know Homer. I mean, we know this, right? Um, and the thing that the thing that we cannot lose sight of is that human beings, first and foremost, like prior to philosophy or whatever, they try to express themselves through story, right? Like, and that makes total sense, right? Because the human life has a kind of narrative structure in and of itself. Um, and and these are stories, and they are trying to present something to us, which we can take up in philosophical inquiry, theological inquiry. I mean, that's different, but like the primary mode is just story, right? And these are some of the stories that fed into the other stories that fed into the present. And so it's like, it makes sense to start there. I just don't think that we have to be so queasy about that.
No, I think it's good. I like what you say about our identity, right? Because our culture, where we are, the things that have formed us, is not globalized and abstract, right? It's very concrete
Right.
in where we've lived. And so one of the reasons that I'll tell people to read the great books is because, listen, everyone's a disciple of somebody, right? You might not have ever read, Nietzsche or Kant or anyone else, but I guarantee you think like them, right? We're downstream from these guys. And so a lot of think about reading the great books is actually just reclaiming your intellect. And what we see in Homer, which I agree with you, starting with a narrative is beautiful. And actually, when you see people like Socrates or Plato's Socrates and our Lord, like having this somewhat poetic philosophy, communicating yourself through these narratives seems to be a very high level of teaching, right? And so I think Homer, for me, I've grown in my appreciation of Homer over the years. But once the Iliad, once you get past everyone getting speared in the face, and the Odyssey, you get past every island, here comes a monster, and the things that I think kind of capture our imagination when we're younger, which is good because those things serve a purpose. Like really, like Homer as a teacher of human nature, insofar as like having appreciation for like this is where a lot of the conversations begin. Like this is where a lot of them start. Like our conversations say, and like obviously Catholicism has a very rich history of trying to articulate the relationship between divine providence and the free will of men. And here in Homer, right, you can see there's tension between fate and how much agency do the people have. What's the difference between Zeus and fate even to begin with, right? Or what's it mean to be a good man? I mean, these are perennial questions that we're going to ask for the next 3,000 years, including today. And they start with Homer.
Yeah. And I think also, as Christians, you do get something of an appreciation of how capacious and generous Christianity is in terms of its ability to absorb these other influences. So you see it um, in the interplay between Athens and Jerusalem, right? Tertullian did not win out there, right? We did not have to choose one or the other. It was very easy to kind of absorb it into itself. But then you also see when we get to the missionary periods, of course, the first missionary period was the barbarians, was the Europeans. Somehow we never talk about that anymore.
Right.
But when you have the Christian missions going into the Near East, and you realize, like, if you study, for example, Jesuits in China, and how they're able to absorb totally different source material into the Christian story. I mean, it really is. It speaks to something of the universal nature of Christianity when you realize that actually Homer's not a threat. and neither is whatever the equivalent is in your culture, right? And I think that's, a bit of wisdom too, because I think sometimes we get in this reactive posture where we think, and there are lots of reasons for that posture that makes sense. But when we're in that posture, we kind of lose sight of the fact that Christianity has this ability to bring everything into itself without losing its truth. And I
Yeah.
find that really deep and powerful personally.
Yeah, truth is truth, right? So wherever we find it,
Yep.
right, there's an enlightenment of the mind. Yeah, I think that the
Yep.
predominant themes that I see in book 20, one is fate, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you've helped us kind of unpack that, because I think we see how much Odysseus is reliant on faith, or excuse me, on fate, the faith that he has to have to a certain degree in that fate as kind of cascading down through the gods. Because I think that's, to me, that's like the main predominant theme. And then Homer, again, as you reminded us, this is originally an oral tradition at a feast. The back half of the Odyssey, the pace slows down tremendously. And so now we're kind of getting this slow build up that, like, hey, the prophet
It's gonna
deceives.
pick up though.
Right. It is. Like, finally, right? Finally, the prophet is looking around being like, you know what? This whole hall is so drenched in blood. I'm out of here. Like, you idiots have no idea what's going to happen. And to agree, like we already talked about, I'm not really sure how much the suitors have the capacity at this moment to even like self-correct. Any other comments or thoughts on book 19?
Aren't we doing book 20?
Sorry,
I'm
book 20.
confused. Yeah. I'm like, I have so many thoughts about book 19.
Sorry. We only have so much time. Yeah, book 20. Sorry. Book 20.
No, yeah. I mean, I think, I'm just very struck by the kind of frenzy at the end, and just the kind of Joseph Pieper has this little book on divine madness. Have you read it?
Yes, it's a good book.
Yeah. So I'm kind of interested in the various forms of frenzy or divine madness. So I always love that when you encounter it in Greek literature. And I think there at the end, you have wouldn't you say it's a kind of Dionysian frenzy? I mean, we're not talking about Dionysius. This isn't the Bacchae, but it's like same vibe, right?
No, I very much like your comparison to the Bacchae. I liked that a lot.
And because I think this really this strikes students as crazy. It's like, oh well, they've lost all capacity for reason, which is true, right? They're not people who come out of a Dionysian frenzy often don't know what they did. It's but and it is a way of being subject to the gods. But I think it's actually really interesting that the Greeks kind of noticed this right? And are willing to confront it in a variety of different ways and forms throughout Greek literature. The fact that we not only have this capacity to kind of lose ourselves, but we like it. Uh, and why is that, right? Why, what's delicious about it actually? And, I don't think that here you get such an exploration of that, in the way that you do in the Bacchae, for example. You get a really deep and rich exploration of it, but it's there, right? And it's just it's this thing that the Greeks are aware of that I think, again, from a Christian point of view, and Joseph Pieper is so great on this. It's like what's the reality there that is important for us to pay attention to, and what does that say about ourselves, right? And if there is this appetite for self-transcendence, right? What are the ways in which it goes bad? and what are the ways in which it's good, right? Those are the kinds of questions that this sort of thing raises. And anyway, I love it. The good stuff, I think, is coming in terms of the actual plot of this. The action picks up. But no, I mean, book 20, there's not a lot action-wise going on.
But I like you focusing on the divine madness at the end. And this is another good example, right, of this cascading down throughout history into a great conversation that Homer starts to introduce us to. Because we've talked about on the podcast previously, sometimes you read these passages about the gods and it's like they're so conflicting and antagonistic. And like, how does anyone believe in these things? And it's like, listen, that's going to be noted. And you're getting set up for Plato's Euthyphro, right? That's what you're getting set up for. And I think in the same way, we see this divine madness that's really going to then terminate in, violence. And I mean, you could play with this a lot, right? Because also there's the lust of Penelope and things like this. And then that goes downstream into, what is that, Euripides, right? Who writes the Bacchae, I believe. And so you have the Bacchae, and then the Bacchae, in a lot of ways, is haunting then Plato's Symposium, right? On what is this divine madness. So this is one of the reasons we read these great books and we look at them as teachers.
And the Phaedrus. The
Phaedrus as well. Yeah, so no, very good.
Yeah. Right, which goes all the way up to one of the great Catholic novelists of the 20th century, Donna Tartt. The Secret History, which is one of my favorite novels. It's all about divine madness.
There you go.
So yeah, no, it's a great. There's a great little kernel there. I think you can't really unpack what's going on here, except by getting into stuff that I will respect your podcast by not looking ahead.
No, I appreciate that. But I think you've helped us. I think you've helped us tremendously to help kind of understand fate and some of the predominant themes that are in book 20, right? So before we close, where can people find more about you and your work?
Where can people learn about me and my work? I have a website, jenniferandfrey.com. It has, I think, a bunch of my publications, both popular and academic. But probably the best way to get to know me without knowing me is my podcast, right? Because my podcast is just conversations like this, searching conversations about literature, philosophy, and theology. And I think a lot of my personality and views come out in these conversations, as you might expect. So sacredandprofanelove.com. You can start by listening to the episode on Donna Tartt and divine madness. It's really fun. It's with a Dominican priest, Father Michael Sherwin, who's an accomplished Thomist and a scholar at the Angelicum.
And you're also on Twitter or X or whatever we're supposed to call it now. Right?
Oh gosh, I'm on Twitter, but don't follow me on Twitter.
Follow for all the hot takes. I think that's actually where we originally connected, was Twitter.
We did connect on Twitter. Yes, one of my best decisions was to just DM you and be like, maybe this is weird, but I'm going to be in Tulsa and I'd like to meet you.
Yeah, well, look, it worked out great. And now you have your own college. So, congratulations.
Yeah.
No, that's very good. Well, Dr. Jennifer Frey, I really appreciate you being on and kind of helping us through the text. We deeply appreciate it. And next week, we'll be talking about book 21. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all that you do here.
Yeah, take care.